Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you for coming back to the Agronomy in Action Insight Series webinar this morning. We are very happy for you to be with the Golden Harvest team. Today, we have an hour packed of agronomy for you all. Our topic's going to be around final thoughts for the 2025 season and how to set ourselves up for success. I want to thank you for joining today, but I also want to thank you for joining over the last 6 weeks. We've had really fun getting in front of you all here and bringing forward some really impactful and thoughtful agronomy content. So for our hour this morning, we have 3 Golden Harvest team members with us. We have Steve Wilkins back on this morning, our Eastern Agronomy Manager for Golden Harvest. And then we have 2 agronomists. We have Adam Mayer, our agronomist in Minnesota and Northeast Iowa. And we have Wade Looker, who is our agronomist in Ohio and is our agronomist for the Northeast of the United States. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Steve here to just get us ready for the session here this morning and take over the content. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for one final Agronomy in Action webinar here this morning. With this being our final one, we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach this year, something we've not done in the past, and take and summarize some of the things that we've heard in the previous webinars, and also try to condense and relay what we want you all thinking about as we head to the fields here in the not too distant future. Spring 2025 is upon us. And when you're driving down the road and you're thinking in your truck or you're looking out the window trying to plan for what this season's going to be, we thought it'd be nice to take a couple of reminders and a couple of things we want on the front of your mind as we head to the season ahead. So with that, we've got a couple of topics that we're going to go through today. We're going to spread the gamut. We're going to go from soil fertility, corn rootworm management. We're going to talk about soybeans, soybean management. We'll hit on a few things about weather as well. So buckle up. It's going to be a fast hour that we have ahead of us. Please ask your questions as you have them. And to get started here, we will transition and roll over to Mr. Adam Mayer to start us off with a talk around soils and soil fertility.
All right, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. We're going to start out with some agronomy basics, and some of those basics a lot of times revolve around our fertility program and what we have available for our plants. And I just want to revisit again on a little bit of a few things to look at on that soil test that you have pulled for this last season. So to start out here, I have some data that was pulled from FinBin is what it's called, but this is a farm financial database that University of Minnesota has available for growers to use, and they will input all of their farm financial data into it. So this is kind of an unbiased, really unique look at some parameters around profitability. So what I did was look at the bottom 20% of profitable, so the least profitable farms, the bottom 20% of profitability for farms. And we can see some of the facts and figures that come out of that group of folks. Average yield around 176, average seed cost per acre 127, land rent 236, fertilizer per acre 279. And then let's look at the inverse here, and those high performers, the most profitable growers, and what their average costs were for some things, as well as yield. So you can see that yield is at 196, average seed per acre is 117, land rent 216, average fertilizer per acre 219. So let's break this down a little bit. There's a few things that really jump out to me. So when I think of the most profitable growers, a lot of times I think of size and scale, and that they're probably getting some pretty big breaks when it comes to some of the inputs, that sort of thing, and then maybe can do some things on rent as well. And it's kind of interesting that most profitable, they are getting more yield, which is obviously huge to more profitability, but the seed cost per acre is really not that significant at $10 an acre. Rent was not significantly different. Obviously a few instances we've had a little less rent, but the real surprising one that might be a little counterintuitive to what a lot of people think is these growers are getting almost 20 bushels more by spending $60 less per acre on their fertilizer bill. So that one was pretty eye-opening to me, and kind of comes back to the importance of dialing that fertilizer dollar in and making sure that we're spending the dollars where they need to be spent and not spending them where they don't. So that's kind of the premise of what a few things that we're going to touch on here to start out with. So I want to just look at and reiterate, a few things that you might see on your regular soil test that you normally have done by either yourself or some other consultant. But the first thing where my eyes go to generally is that soil pH. I really want to make sure that's in line. You can almost throw a lot of the other things out without having that, and that 6.3 to 6.8 is a real nice place to be. If we're below that 6.3, we really want to start thinking about doing some management to make sure we're getting that in more of the sweet spot as far as that pH goes for soil nutrient availability and biological activity, etc. So the other thing that you're going to see on here is a multitude of your nutrients, and you'll see next to it VH or an H or an M, and those are the categories that these values are put into. So a very high, a high, medium, etc. And then the numeral value is generally a parts per million of whatever nutrient we're looking at. So these are kind of important to look at and understand. The other thing, you might get a different format of the data from your consultant, and it could look something like this on a map format. So what we're looking at here is phosphorus levels for a given field here, and it was grid sampled, and you can see that green is in that very high category, red is the very low category, and we have some things in between here. So I just wanted to showcase this because this is probably a pretty normal field of what we see out there with some variability to it. And, to that point, I believe this field would be a great candidate for variable rate script and maybe saving some fertilizer in those areas that we really don't necessarily need it. So I just wanted to point out that optimum level, when we look at where some of these soil test recommendations are coming from, this optimum category, a medium category, depending on where you're getting your information from, is really that critical level that has been determined where yield is at 100% if we're in that optimum category. And if we're below that, that yield is likely less than 100%, and we're going to definitely have good response by adding more fertility. And then obviously in the high and very high categories, it's less paramount to have an additional need for fertility to get to 100% yield level. So you can see those levels. These recommendations here are out of Iowa State, but they're very similar for most institutions across the Corn Belt. So that optimum is right around, we'll say an average for your phosphorus of 20 parts per million. And that optimum for potassium is around that 200 parts per million. So kind of another way to look at this, I like to present it this way is what is the number of times or expected percentage that by the addition of fertilizer will actually help me out for this grain crop that I'm going to grow. So in this case, if you look at that medium category, I have 27%, a quarter of the time, I'm actually going to see a corn yield increase by the addition of broadcast fertilizer. So it's not as much as one might think. in that medium category, and hence why it's kind of that optimal. And obviously that increases pretty substantially when you get into that low and very low. You're going to have the biggest return on investment if we're in those lower categories and spots that have less fertilizer available, obviously. The other way to look at it is if I were not to apply fertilizer in a soil test area that had something in these given categories, how much yield can I expect? So like we talked before, that high and very high category, even without the addition of fertilizer, you can expect to be at, this is university, so they're never going to put 100%, but it's as close as 100% as you're going to possibly get there. So, and then even in that optimal category, you're right at 98, 99%. And really the addition and the probability goes up when you get in that low and very low category to see a response there to our fertilizer application. So you may be asking, how long can I get by with the, not applying fertilizer to my farm? And, we always talk about that fertility as being kind of a bank where we can make deposits as well as, withdrawals. So how long can we make withdrawals without seeing significant deficiencies in our plants and in our fields out there longer term? So there's been some studies and research done on this. And on the left here, this graph is indicating the number of years on the bottom there versus our crop removal without a phosphorus application. So you can see that this is a linear regression here where we see a drawdown or a decrease over time, and that decrease is about 1 to 2 parts per million per year. So if you think about that, that first graphic we saw in that soil test map, there were some areas in there that were 80 to 100 parts per million phosphorus. We could go nearly 50 years on a drawdown without having large impact to our soil fertility or what we see going on from a yield standpoint in that field. On the right-hand side, we see some potassium data, and the individual soil tests for this data are shown by that light gray square. And so you can see there's a lot more variability when it comes to potassium soil tests, and that is true and indicative of what you will see on your farm and out in the fields. Potassium is one I really like to see multiple years and multiple environments to be able to get a true look at what's happening in the field with potassium, because it's a little bit more dependent on that soil moisture and tie up in the soil, etc. So it's a little bit less predictable, but the trend is definitely similar to what we see with phosphorus there. But I'm bringing up and focusing a little bit more on phosphorus in today's talk just because of the price dynamics that surround phosphorus specifically, with MAP and DAP being a lot more pricey compared to, say, a potash or even nitrogen comparatively for this upcoming season. So if there's an opportunity for us to make some adjustments on our phosphorus, is probably going to be more impactful than those other nutrients going into this season. So I get the question, well, is there anything else I can do to stretch my fertilizer dollar further? And here's some data out of the University of Illinois. And this is more around the 4R approach when it comes to fertilizer, making sure we have that right source, right placement, right timing, etc. And this case here, we did some additional banded P where they went ahead and did some banded fertilizer pre-plant using Micro Essentials SZ. Make sure we had some fertilizer versus plots that did not have the phosphorus fertilizer in it. And you can see a nice upward trend here. I do want to point out those black dots above the bars are locations or soil tests that actually tested greater than that critical point of 20 parts per million we talked about earlier. And same on the soybeans here on the right-hand side, the same type of setup here, what we're looking at. And the data in the end showed that with that banded phosphorus, we actually saw an average of 5.5% additional yield out of that phosphorus application, along with being above that critical level. So placement is extremely important and actually trumps what our soil test shows out there, and we can still get and stretch our fertilizer dollar further if we're using more of that 4R approach. Very similar to what we saw on the soybean side, a 5.6% response. I think it was 11.5 bushel average on the corn, and 3.5 or 3.8 on the soybeans, if I remember correctly. So some nice yield gains, even where we had good fertility, soil test fertility levels there. So this kind of leads me into the next question. We talked a little bit about P and K. Let's pivot towards that nitrogen, our next or our biggest input cost there on the corn side of things. And I have a lot of guys that take the more-on approach with the nitrogen, and that the more we put on, the more yield benefit we're going to get from that. And that can be the case to a point. And one of those things that's really going to help you to get a benefit about the addition of nitrogen is making sure that we have our nutrients in balance, specifically our P and K. So here's some data on the left-hand side from Iowa State, and this is showing increasing nitrogen rate there on the bottom, and yield on the y-axis there on the left, and the addition of potassium fertilizer versus no potassium fertilizer in conjunction with that nitrogen. You can see we needed to have that K, the potassium available, with that synergistic effect we see and that interaction with potassium and nitrogen to actually see a response, and a response that's going to pay us back some dividends there with P or with the K component there. On the right-hand side, you can see some data out of the University of Wisconsin, and it's showing a very similar thing. They looked at different soil tests for P and K, and that black circle there that you see kind of across the middle is showing a low soil test P and K. And as we talked, that's probably the thing that needs to be corrected before we're going to see a big response with that additional nitrogen rate. So very similar data suggesting that we need to have our nutrients in balance to be able to see some responses there. And this is really shown pretty nicely in something that's called Mulder's chart. And this just shows all the interactions with all the soil nutrients that are needed to complete that life cycle within a plant. And you can see the antagonistic relationship versus a stimulation relationship between a lot of these nutrients. And you can see that nitrogen and potassium, there's a direct correlation there, and there's many other interactions here that can be either positive or negative. So we have to keep in mind that this is an integrated approach when it comes to fertility, and we can't just look at one individual thing and say that we're gonna either cut this thing out or just focus on one thing by adding it. So we need to keep this in mind for our 25 growing season. So the other question I get is, okay, if I have my soil nutrients in balance and have a good system, I feel like from a soil health aspect, whatever, can I reduce my N rate to maybe save some money? So here's some data that came from the Practical Farmers, and this is on-farm field data from participating growers. And the design of this was really to have the grower do their standard nitrogen rate and then do a reduced nitrogen rate. And they didn't necessarily have defined parameters for what those values were. But from this data set, there was an average reduction of 23% of what the nitrogen rate was put out there. And the starting N rates were between 120 pounds and 232 to start with. So, 120 is probably on the light end for my comfort level in quite a few cases. And 232 is probably on the heavy end, especially on a soybean ground type of environment. So the data showed that on the left, where we have the green bars showing up there, that about a third of the trials did see a significant change in the yield as far as a decrease goes with that decreased N application. And likely those were ones that probably were pretty low as far as that starting point. But the interesting thing is on the right-hand side is what's your return on investment and your financial savings potentially. And 86% of these trials showed cost savings with that reduction in N application. So what this goes to show me is that there's an opportunity for us to do some testing on our own farms and kind of figure out and dial in where that optimal rate might be. And I get all the time, well, what is that optimal rate? And so I find a good starting rate to, give a recommendation for a grower is just go to cornnratecalc.org. And this will help you find for your local geography that maximum return to nitrogen rate. And I'd start somewhere in that range and go plus or minus from there to really understand on your farm with your circumstances, where is that true best return on investment for nitrogen rate. And what I've seen in the past couple of years, it might be a little lower than you were expecting. And we know that timing can be huge on this nitrogen conversation as well. So just a few comments to wrap up this part. The NPK, if we have soil tests above 20 parts per million, broadcast fertilizer likely is not going to have a huge response. A 4R approach is probably our best approach to all applications. Potassium is really one that we can manage to 200 parts per million, but these results are a little less predictable. So that's one I'm more hesitant on backing off from compared to like a phosphorus. And then, on the nitrogen side, that increase will not show a return without being in balance as far as the rest of our nutrients there. And we might have the opportunity to decrease that if we have a nice, healthy system there. So I'm going to continue on here and jump topics here and talk a little bit about corn rootworm. It's pretty near and dear to my heart with being in a pretty big hotspot for a lot of corn rootworms. So I just wanted to point out a few things that we might see for this coming year and what we saw from last year. So let's level set and ground truth, where we're at from a corn rootworm life cycle standpoint. Right now, we're in obviously winter, springtime. Our rootworms are currently in the soil as an egg. When it comes to about 700 soil GDUs, we'll have that emergence right along with our fireflies. Right at that lightning bug time frame, we'll see our larvae come out in that June to July time frame and start feeding. Those larvae will pupate. And then in August, we'll start seeing those adult beetles emerge, and then they'll lay eggs for the fall. And this is important in that we do only have one generation per season with these corn rootworms. So let's take a look back, and it might be painful for some of you, but let's look at some weather from last year and just point a few things out. So this is precipitation maps from last year. If we look at that May time frame, we had a lot of Iowa that had excess precipitation, led to saturated conditions. June was all about southern Minnesota, southeast South Dakota, northwest Iowa. And then July, we had some Missouri, Illinois areas that had some pretty heavy rainfall that led to saturated conditions. So this leads me into my poll question. With all of that rainfall, let's think about, can corn rootworm survive those saturated conditions? So your options are yes, eggs and larvae both can survive saturated conditions. Eggs can, larvae can't. Eggs cannot, larvae can. Or no, neither can survive those situations there. All right, we have our results, and yeah, this is an interesting one. So eggs can, larvae cannot. So the majority of you were close, not quite. So eggs don't necessarily have to breathe. So we were in an oxygen limited situation with those saturated conditions. So eggs generally can persist, and the larvae are the ones that can drown. And that's our best way to reduce larval populations, is actually by drowning. So I want to level set real quickly on where those eggs are in the soil profile. When we look at the western corn rootworms, they generally lay their eggs in that 3 to 8 inch soil depth profile. And the northerns are going to be a little bit shallower than that, in the 2 to 6 inch soil depth. So why this is important, I had a lot of questions over the winter here, as we had some open soils out there and had some significantly cool temperatures at points during the winter months. So what's that cold tolerance of rootworms, and what do we have to get to before they're going to have mortality? And the answer is around -7.5 degrees Celsius or 18.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's for a little bit more of a sustained temperature time frame, or get down to -17 or close to that 0 Fahrenheit to really do much damage from a mortality standpoint. So how cold did we get? That's the question. And this is not air temperature. We need to get soil temperature where those eggs are to really have an impact here. So these are some data points. On the left is from Waseca, Minnesota. And this is at different soil depths. So at 2 inch, 4 inch, 8 inch. And so we'll go use that -7.5 and -17 as our parameters for the temperature we need to get to really see some mortality. And we did get to that -7.5, but unfortunately, this is the one date that I found the coldest recorded temperatures for soil temps, and that was on that January 20th date there. So we really didn't have long enough, and we never got to that 17 below Celsius to really do enough damage. So unfortunately, we're probably going to have some in that 2 inch that we did have some mortality, but probably the ones that survive were ones that are going to be really good survivors out in our field anyway. So long story short, we still do need to have our management hat on for this coming season when it comes to corn rootworm out there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our next topic with Wade.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Wade Looker. I'm the agronomist covering Ohio in our Eastern Business Unit, and we kind of have a smorgasbord of topics for us to discuss today. The first of 3 that I'm going to talk about is soybean planting date. This is something that maybe you've heard me talk about in the past, but it's something that I'm pretty passionate about. When we look at the climate of the ag economy right now, we need to do all that we can to increase yield. And actually, soybean planting date is one of those things that we can do to increase yield while also not investing more dollars into our crop. And so let's talk a little bit about soybean planting date. Soybean planting date is super important because it's all about the length of time that we have for our soybeans to grow and produce soybeans. I like the analogy because it works really well that soybeans and corn for that matter, they are factories that turn things like sunlight, water, and nutrients into grain. They truly are factories that take inputs and create an output, the grain that we harvest. So it's no different than a window factory or a steel factory or a tire factory for that matter. The longer that those factories are open, the more output, the more top end yield potential they can potentially produce. And so we can extend that growing season with soybeans in two ways. One, we can increase relative maturity. We can make that growing season longer based upon relative maturity. We can extend it in the fall in that way. The other way that we do that is with planting dates. We can extend our growing season, keep our factory open longer on the front side by planting earlier. And so let's talk about that. You've probably heard in the past that tall beans don't mean high yielding beans, and there's truth to that. But there's also truth in that vegetative growth is very important for total top end yield potential. And the reason for that is branching. So the more branches that we get, the more nodes we have. Nodes are where we set flowers, where we set pods, and where we grow beans. So nodes are very important. When we extend that growing season, particularly on the front side, we get a longer period of time for vegetative growth. We get more nodes per plant, which means more flowers, more pods, more beans, hopefully more top end yield in the fall. So it just builds that factory out so that we can produce more if we get the conditions that are advantageous for that. So in addition to just extending the overall growing season, there's more to it that helps us increase our total top end yield potential. First is capturing sunlight. If we plant earlier, we're able to close those rows earlier. There's a longer period of time for us to harvest that sunlight and turn it into grain. When sunlight hits that bare soil surface, that's basically like a wasted input that you would have in any other factory. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're as efficient as possible in turning that sunlight into grain. The other thing is that it actually extends that period of reproductive growth for our soybean plants. So we have more time to produce flowers, to set pods, and then to fill those pods. And then additionally, by increasing or by planting earlier, we're able to shift some of that reproduction earlier into the growing season. And so if we're able to get plants that are flowering in, let's say, late June or early July, usually the weather's a little bit more advantageous during that time frame. Usually it's not quite as hot. Usually we have a little bit more rain, a little bit more moisture that time of year than we do, say, mid to late August. And so again, if we're able to shift some of that reproduction earlier on, we're likely shifting it into a time period that's better suited for that plant anyway. So all that's well and good, but how does that equate to yield? This is a study that we did here internally with our Golden Harvest Agronomy team. This has 17 different site years from the years 2000 to 2020. And what we saw is a yield bump by planting early, especially when we consider early versus truly late planting. And so what we saw here was a decline from the beginning to middle of April towards the middle of May. And then really once we got towards late May into June, that's where we saw that big precipitous drop off. We saw that beyond late May, we lost about 1% of yield every 2 days. So really important there. And we aren't the only ones that have seen this. This is data from University of Illinois, and they actually saw a even more extreme penalty towards planting late. You know, that gap from April 23rd to May 9th was about 6 bushels. We waited another couple weeks, we lost another 6 bushels. But then that May 31st to June 1st timeframe, again, we see that really steep decline where we went from 6 bushels, now it's 8 when we plant at June 15th. So again, planting early is something that's pretty achievable. It doesn't cost any more money, and it is an easy way for us to gain soybean yield. And again, in today's markets, what an easy way, what an important way to gain additional dollars in your pocket. The next topic in our smorgasbord of agronomy here today is soybean cyst nematodes. Let's take a couple minutes and talk about that. Soybean cyst nematode is a pest that affects soybeans across basically the entire Corn Belt. The shaded counties here are the ones that we have confirmed soybean cyst nematode pressure in. And I would argue that the handful of counties across the Midwest here that aren't shaded in is probably more of a sampling error than anything. So if you're watching this right now, you very likely have soybean cyst nematode pressure out in your fields right now. To really underline how important and impactful soybean cyst nematode is the fact that it causes about $1.2 billion in losses to our farmers across the U.S. annually, just in lost bushels. So really, really impactful stuff here. How do we manage it? So there's a couple of different ways that we can manage it. First is through genetics, through genes that help fight against soybean cyst nematode. If you open up our seed guide or any of our competitors' seed guide, you're likely to see a lot of different varieties with the PI88788 gene. And the PI88788 gene is a gene that is naturally occurring in a soybean plant, and it really helps fight against soybean cyst nematode. It's been around a long time and has done a lot of really good stuff for us. However, we are starting to see a race shift, meaning that, frankly, PI88788 doesn't work as well as it used to. The populations of soybean cyst nematode are adapting and evolving, and so PI88788 just isn't working quite as well. If you look at the map here, look at my home state of Ohio, you see 54%. And that means that 54% of the sampled populations were able to reproduce at a greater than 10% rate when introduced to PI88788. So again, 54% of those populations are doing pretty good against the PI88788 gene. Therefore, we've seen a broader adaptation of peaking. And what peaking is a very similar gene to PI88788. It is a gene that is naturally occurring within the soybean plant that helps that plant control soybean cyst nematode. Here on the bottom right, you can see the amount of peaking varieties that we have been selling has been jumping pretty dramatically over the past few years. So let's talk a little bit more about peaking. Peaking really isn't new. It's something that's been around a while. It was discovered in 1957. And so again, it's got a good history, a good track record with it. It actually offers stronger control than PI88788, which we had talked about. But because of that, it's really important to continue to rotate, because if it's stronger, then that means it's a lot easier to build resistance to the peaking gene right now than it is PI88788. And so in order to prolong how strong peaking is against soybean cyst nematode, I do recommend that we rotate between peaking and PI88788. The other thing that I want to note is, for a long time, peaking really resided in group 1 and group 2 relative maturity zones. Our breeders have done a fantastic job of pushing that envelope later and later. So that opens the door for customers and growers across the Midwest that may not have had really access to the peaking gene, simply because the relative maturities that they plant, weren't really suited to having peaking in them. And so that's been a big change and a very exciting change that we've noticed across the U.S. Finally, the last kind of tool in the toolbox for soybean cyst nematode is seed treatments. And so we have a product called Saltro, does a great job. And it handles both soybean cyst nematode and SDS, sudden death syndrome. That's a very important relationship between the two. So if you're concerned about sudden death syndrome, you really do need to have a robust soybean cyst nematode management program. And here's why. Soybean cyst nematode, it'll drill into that root. It'll open that root up. And that acts as a vector for sudden death syndrome to enter that plant. So it would be no different than, say, you're out doing field work, you cut your hand, you don't administer proper first aid, you get lots of dirt in it, don't take care of it, you're probably going to wind up with an infection in that wound. It's kind of the same premise with this, where SCN opens that root up, that allows that sudden death syndrome to enter that plant. When you're driving around in, say, August, and you see these fields that turn yellow, leaves start to turn yellow, they drop the petioles, you can just tell they look sick, that's probably some SDS in those fields. And so largely we think of SDS as a truly late season disease because that's when we see it. However, SDS is an early season disease. It enters that plant early on, and it lives within that plant relatively harmlessly until later on in the season when it starts to produce those toxins that we see. And so being able to control both of these at the same time with the same product is really, really important. And that's why we've had such good success with Saltro. The final topic in our smorgasbord of agronomy here today is going to be late season management, particularly surrounding corn. So let's take a look. This is a chart here on the right-hand side that I think a lot of folks have seen. I like it a lot and I use it a lot. What it does is it really shows where dry matter is allocated within the plant. So is this dry matter going to the grain, the tassel cob husk, stalks and leaves, or the leaf blades themselves? So it shows where that dry matter is accumulated. And then it also shows when that dry matter is accumulated. So for example, let's look at the blue or purple color here. On the top right-hand side, that's going to be our grain. We can see that about half of the total dry matter of our corn plant is the grain itself. And we can also see that that is all accumulated after tassel, which makes sense. We know that our grain is going to be accumulated after tassel. So let's draw a line right here. This is going to be tassel. Everything to the right of that occurs after tassel. Everything to the left occurs before tassel. So I want you to think, when do you make most of your management, if not all of your management? Probably on the left side of this red line. Now look at where is most of the dry matter accumulation occurring? On the right side of that line. And so if we're making fertilizer applications, before planting, maybe we're putting some fertilizer down with the planter. Maybe we're coming back side dress at V3 to V5, V6, something like that. But usually that last application that we do is that fungicide application at tassel. Now, today's fungicides are better than they've ever been. They're fantastic. We get really good residual out of some of these premium fungicides. We like that. But the best fungicides, are probably going to get us best case scenario to this point. Probably not quite all the way to R5, probably not quite all the way to that dent stage that we call it. So if we draw a line over to right here, that leaves this whole top right-hand corner totally unprotected. That's an important top right-hand corner, guys. Whether it's 25%, 20%, whatever the number is, that is a significant portion of our dry matter accumulation in our plant that we really are not managing for. So let's put it in perspective. That top right-hand corner is about 20% of all the dry matter that we're going to accumulate on that plant. But that, given that half of our total dry matter is grain, that's actually 40%. 40% of our grain is accumulated in the kernel after the R5 dent stage. After R5. And so if you think about it, that's 40% of your yield. That's 40% of the weight that you're going to sell that elevator. And I argue that it could be even larger. Think of a product that have a tremendous amount of kernel flex. They get a lot of their yield based upon kernel flex and kernel size. So that number could even grow based upon the various hybrids that you're planting. So again, to put an actual number on it, 40% of 200 bushel corn is 80 bushels an acre that we have hanging out there left to be determined after dent. Now you're probably sitting there thinking to yourself, well, I won't lose all of that 40%, right? Like my corn's not going to be dead at R5, right? Like it's going to last a little while. Maybe. So we're going to watch a video here. This video I took last year on August 29th in Western Ohio. I got a phone call and said, hey, 15J91, one of our hybrids, it's got a lot of tar spot in it. And I thought, that's weird. Like normally 15J is really good on tar spot. I wouldn't expect that. So I went out to check out the field. And sure enough, 15J91 had a lot of tar spot in it. Talked with the farmer, exited the field, and looked at the adjoining field that butts up next to it. And I thought, oh boy, this isn't necessarily a 15J91 problem. We just have incredible tar spot pressure in this area. So let's take a look at the video to see the tar spot pressure that we're seeing.
I was sprayed with a fungicide as well, and it is dead. It gave up. We got ears dropping over. Stalks are lodging really all over the place here. We'll do a push test, and that they give give up. So super heavy tar spot pressure. West Central Ohio.
So again, that was a competitor right next door to 15J91. So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think that customer lost his 40%? Because that corn was dead at R5. That was August 29th. He could have run the combine through it. And frankly, he should have. Because this was that field about a month later. About a month later, we had a hurricane come through, and it brought really high winds across much of southwest and west central Ohio. This is that side by side. So I think he lost that 40%. But even more than that, he had down corn. So the yield that he did achieve and that he did get on the ears now on the ground, and I don't think he probably got it all. But it gets deeper than that. He has employees. You know, he had to pay those employees more hours to harvest that corn. He probably incurred more maintenance costs, more repair costs. You know, harvesting down corn's really hard on equipment. And then there's opportunity costs associated with it too. You know, he spent more time harvesting that field when he could have been harvesting other fields. And we all know that you don't add bushels by leaving corn stand out in the field longer than you have to. So the point of all of this is not that we all need to go out and start making fungicide applications at R4. That's not the point. The point is that as we head into 2025, I'd really like for you to review your management strategy, review your game plan, and see if there's anything that you can do just to push management maybe a little bit later. So for example, if you normally make your side dress application at V3, you know, if you can get across the corn at V8, you know, that's going to ensure that more of that nitrogen is available later on into the growing season so you can have more of that last 40% covered. We want as much of that top right corner of our chart taken care of as we can. You know, maybe you live in an area where there's a strong history of tar spot, and so you're accustomed to making fungicide applications every year. Go out and scout at tassel. And if you don't see anything at tassel, well, maybe you delay that application a week or two. That way, it extends that residual activity from that fungicide deeper into that grain filling process. Or maybe you know, like, hey, I live in a really heavy tar spot area. I'm probably going to have tar spot that I need to control at tassel. Well, select a hybrid that is really good on tar spot. That way we can rely on the hybrid's ability to handle that disease late season when we know that our fungicide is going to be run out at that point. So that's the point. Just take some time, review what you're currently doing, and see if there's a way that you can hold on to more of that 40% later on in the season. With that, that's the end of my my talk on the smorgasbord of agronomy topics, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Steve Wilkins, who's going to tell us all about the weather in 2025 and what we can expect.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Wade. Thank you, Adam. Really good information there. I always laugh when I hear people say the corn crop is made in July, and then I realize it's not. It's more about the last half of the grain fill where we can really add, subtract yield. In the time we have left this morning, we want to talk about a couple of things, and basically, I want to talk about the weather. It's something that we talk about nonstop, really can't control it, but I do think it's worth understanding where we're at today and what that could potentially mean for us in the growing season ahead. So what I'd like to do is start with a little bit of a quiz question, and we'll get to that. So for the year ahead of us, as we get into planting, what are the cycles that are occurring? Is it the 89-year Gleisberg cycle? Do we have a lunar cycle? Or do we have a solar cycle? Or potentially, do we have all of them? So we'll give you a quick couple of seconds here to put in what you think your guess is. Correct. So for 80% of us, you are right. Not only do we have all of those cycles, we also have some sea surface temperatures as well that lend itself to some challenging potential, and I say potential because we don't know, dry conditions going forward. So as we sit here today, this is a view of the latest drought monitor. For those of us in corn and soybean country, we're sitting at about 80 or so percent of our corn acres sitting in some level of drought, and roughly about 70% of our soybean acres sitting in some drought. Okay, if we take that a little bit different and we look at our subsoil moisture, I'm going to go down to about the 3-foot level, and we zone in here really on what I would say is the core area of our corn belt where we grow our crops. You can see that we're dry. So while the spring rain can easily undo the dryness of the fall and the winter, the ability to have deep, full profiles in many of our areas, that's not going to be the case here this spring. So we're heading in dry, and we have a forecast for dryness. For those of us that follow Mr. Eric Snodgrass, I mean, he's telling us there's a 6 in 10 chance of a pretty substantial drought this year. Okay, so here's a map that gives the outlook of what spring could look like for many of us. And you can see like there could be some opportunity for some recharge and for some ample precipitation here in our more north central to northeast type of corn belt. But dryness looks like it could prevail in the central to central west into the plains area. So there's not much we can do about it unless we have water and access to pivots. But I do think it's something that we should be thinking about as we start to make our plans. And why is that? Well, whether we have access to water or not, our crops still demand water. And we've shown this slide a few times in the previous years. You know, our soybean crop, you need 22, 23 inches of water. Our corn crop, you're going to need a bit more. But we get into that August time period and just realize the demand for moisture is very, very high. You know, for corn, we're taking up about 1/3 of an inch a day for about a 2 to 3 week time period. Soybeans, it's a little bit longer, but we need to understand the needs of our water also as we're going in relatively dry. But as much as we need moisture, heat is the real killer. And this is some work that we've done, and we showed this one in the past too. The reason we had a really good crop in 2023, as dry as we were, is because we did not have excessive heat. And if we get into the growing season ahead of us, if we have too much water, too little water, we can manage that within reason, but heat is the killer. So as you're looking at the weather and your forecasts and stuff, and you get into the month of August, look at nighttime temperatures. And if we're above the 70-degree threshold, we will be losing yield, regardless of how much or how little, how too much moisture we have. Heat kills. And a lot of our work has shown that when we get over 70 degrees, we're losing yield. And our research would say it's generally 3 to 4.5 bushel yield loss when we get into these 70+ degree temperatures into the month of August. I want to run through one final example here this morning before we start to wind down and take some questions. One of the areas that I like to work with growers on is how do you plant your hybrids? How do you space them out? I want to run through an example here real quick where let's take a grower where they're planting 5 of our hybrids and they're going a 10-day RM, 105 day to 115, something that on paper looks very good. Let's run through and say, okay, we're going to plant our 15J on April 20th. And we know that silk's at about 1,555 GDUs. We're then going to come back a few days later, plant our 11V76. Then we're going to go and we'll plant some 14B32. We'll plant some 10U97, and we're going to finish with 105 day. And we think that's a really good plan going forward. We spread out our risk for pollination. We spread out our risk for the growing season. But then what I like to show people is, did you really do that? Okay, so on the right-hand side here, I put together a little schematic that shows the way these plants work, the way heat units accumulate. Even though we planted our 15J and our 11V76 about a week apart, they're going to pollinate almost on the exact same day. We come in here and we plant our 14B32 and in our 05U08. Again, different planting dates, different RMs. They're going to silk and pollinate on about the same day. And finally, if we do our 10U97, you can see we can get out a little bit later. Understand when you're planting what that pollination window looks like. and try as best you can to de-risk yourself. Don't like to put all of our eggs in one basket. And let's just make sure that as we go to the planting season here, we give a little bit of thought of not just what our harvest window could look like, but also what the in-season management pollination window looks like as well. So with that, I got a few slides left. I'm going to skip them in the case of time here. We got a couple of questions that we'd like to go through. So I'm going to transition through a few here. And as we do so, I'm just going to give a little bit of a summary of some of the things that Adam and Wade talked about. And I think one of the most important ones is it doesn't make sense to add more nitrogen if your P and your K are not where they need to be. All right, that's a really strong point. Putting down an extra 20, 25 pounds of nitrogen really doesn't matter if your K levels and your P levels aren't sufficient and where they have to be for maximum type yield. At the same time, let's go ahead and let's manage our corn late, because late management of corn can really drive significant kernel size, and that in turn drives significant yield. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time here this morning and for this whole webinar series. I'm going to turn it back to Julia, and I'm going to let her finish up with a couple of the QR codes.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Appreciate the content here. I know we had a lot, and it was a true smorgasbord, as Wade mentioned a few times, but hopefully you picked up a nugget or two. With that, we are at time, but we will take some questions. So we will kind of go over a few minutes here. So if you can stay, great, as we kind of connect with our presenters here. So Wade, Adam, if you want to come off of your mute and camera, would appreciate that, so we can talk about some of these things that have been put into the Q&A. Wade, I know you kind of typed an answer here, but one of the questions that came in was around the soybean planting date and maximizing yield. And one of the questions was, do we need to plant varieties that branch more based on the statements that you made there earlier on?
Yeah, I wouldn't go out and necessarily like choose the bushiest bean that you can find. I would find a variety that has a lot of proven top end yield and then manage that for maximizing yield. So, you know, some beans throw really big beans, that's how they get yield. Some beans throw lots of branches, that's how they can get yield. So there's lots of different ways that beans can achieve those high yields. I think the important part is selecting one that has a proven track record of high yield and then managing it accordingly. You know, even if you have kind of a thinner line bean, planting it early is only going to help with getting more branches on it. So I don't think you necessarily need to just select the most bushy bean that you can possibly find. Just find one with a good track record and then manage accordingly.
So Adam, another one that came in that you did type an answer to, but for the micro essential, the SZ does contain sulfur and zinc. I guess, how is the relationship with this when it comes to N and those University of Illinois trials?
Yeah, so that was a good catch. So obviously MESD also contains things that are not just phosphorus, and that was a study that was intended to show the difference in phosphorus. They, if I remember the study correctly, did correct for the nitrogen, sulfur, zinc in another form on the check plots. So that's how they tried to make sure we were isolating the phosphorus being the difference on that.
Thanks, Adam. Looks like we're slowing down on questions here as a general statement, but there was one other way that maybe you can address when it comes to residue management too. The question was, for the tar spot issue in that particular field in Ohio, was that a corn on corn rotation or was that corn and soy?
Yeah, so this was rotated. It was soybeans the previous year. However, this was long-term no-till, and there was corn residue on top of the ground yet from 2 years ago. And I do think that was a contributing factor. I'm not surprised. Hopefully we don't have those set of conditions again this year.
Awesome. Thanks, Wade. That kind of concludes the questions that are in the Q&A box here this morning. If there are additional questions that come up, please reach out to any of the presenters from this morning or your local Golden Harvest sales representative or agronomist. With that, I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining us here today and throughout the last 6 weeks. It's been a really fun Agronomy in Action Insight series for me to host and lead. So just want to thank you and wish you luck as you move in to the 2025 growing season this year. And a nice reminder to stay safe out there. So thank you, everyone, and have a great Thursday morning.